Hey Vineyard. Today's lecture is all about the storytelling arc. So, if you had me last year and you remember our short story unit, you might remember this lecture because the storytelling arc for a personal narrative essay is going to follow the same exact storytelling arc that a good short story or even a good novel will follow. So, if you have those notes or you really remember that lecture well, you might want to just use this video as review. But if you're new to my class or you're worried in any way about writing your own personal narrative essay, I really do think you should pay close attention to this lecture because your essay is going to follow this storytelling arc as best you can. All right, so without any further ado, let's look at the storytelling arc so that eventually when we start writing our essays, we can implement that arc in our own story. Okay, so if you are taking notes on the PDF handout that I pushed out to Google Classroom, everything that you see bolded in red on this Prezi is what you're writing down. So maybe you're writing your notes down in a separate Google Doc or just on a little note sheet on the side by hand. Everything that you see written in red is the information that you should have for your notes. And again, you can always just review this video if you'd rather just look back at the video if you need a quick refresh. So without any further ado, this is the storytelling arc. So every story, whether it's a short story that's based in fiction or a personal narrative that's nonfiction, starts with the exposition phase. This is when we're introduced to the setting, the characters, the protagonist's ordinary life. This is when we're introduced to the protagonist's daily life before it's disrupted by conflict. So, as soon as we're introduced to the protagonist's ordinary life, a conflict should be introduced. Something that is going to change the protagonist's life forever. This is going to set the story in motion. If this is a happy story, this conflict will probably be a good thing. If this is a sad or tragic story, this conflict could be a bad thing. But it's definitely something new. Something is going to change in our protagonist's life, and they will never be the same after this conflict. So if this is a romance, if you're telling the story of how you fell in love, this is when you first spot that crush. If you're telling an adventure story, this is when you first find the map that leads to treasure. If you're Liam Neeson in Taken, this is when your daughter is kidnapped. Everything following the introduction of the conflict that leads to the climax is called rising action. So all of the steps and adventures that the protagonist faces on his or her journey that leads to the story's climax is rising action. So let's go back. So each step of the rising action is going to lead to the next one. And each step is going to teach the protagonist something important that they need to know to finally reach the story's climactic moment. So basically, all of the steps of the rising action are leading to the climax, are leading to the story's big moment. Then we get to the climax. This is the moment we've been waiting for. The conflict must be faced, and hopefully the protagonist will triumph. They've been preparing for this moment in the rising action. This is the Rocky training. The rising action is sort of the Rocky training montage, and then the climax would be the big fight. If this is a romance story, this is when that teen kisses the crush in the rain. If this is an adventure story, this is when the pirate actually finds the gold, finds that booty. If this is Liam Neeson's story, this is when he actually rescues his kidnapped daughter. Man, teens are always kissing in the rain. If you've ever kissed in the rain, it's not as great as it's cracked up to be. It's cold and wet, kind of gross. After we get the climax, we then get the falling action. This is when loose ends from the story are tied up, the supporting characters and their side issues are resolved. This is basically when all the loose ends are tied up before we get to the conclusion. And then steps 8 and 9 are simply the conclusion, the resolution. Life for the protagonist now finds a new normal and continues on its altered path. The climax, the rising action, it has changed our protagonist forever, and now they've learned a lesson, a good one or a bad one, a happy one or a sad one, and their life will never be the same again. You'll notice that the lifeline is at a higher level than when the story started. This reflects the growth and change in the protagonist's life. It's likely that our protagonist is now wiser or better or stronger or in a better position in general than they were at the beginning of the tale. They are changed in some way from the climax and the rising action that leads to that climax. After we get the resolution, we get a denouement, or this is also called an epilogue. Sometimes the author will give us a bit of the after story. This bit of extra information usually helps wrap the story up. So in The Lord of the Rings, the epilogue is when the hobbits all go back to the Shire after defeating Sauron. Or in Harry Potter, in the final book of Harry Potter, the epilogue is when Harry and Ron and Hermione are much older and they're sending their kids off to school. It's sort of basically just a goodbye or an after information that contributes to the story but isn't necessarily critical to the climactic moment in any way. So that is the storytelling arc. Your personal narrative is going to follow this storytelling arc. And when you are writing your essay, I really think it'd be a good idea for you to revisit this lecture and just make sure that you have some exposition, you introduce a conflict, then you have some rising action, then you have a climax, then some falling action, and then a resolution, and even maybe a denouement or an epilogue. I really want your personal narrative to follow this structure as best it can. Okay, have a nice day.